Okay, so we are moving on to 7.2 with our Chapter 7 notes, Unit 7 notes. So 7.2 is moving forward from 7.1, where 7.1 was what is data, how do we gather data. 7.2 is, okay, now we have data, so what do we do next? What do we use? How do we use all of this raw data that we collected and turn it into something that is more meaningful, so we can draw conclusions from it, as we've kind of started moving on to in our in-class sessions. So we are gonna just do a real quick example of what I'm talking about. We're gonna talk about frequency tables. Again, we've talked about them a little bit, but there's a lot of different things that go into frequency tables, more than what we've already talked about. So we're interested in how many grapes there are in little bunches of grapes. So we've taken a bunch of bunches of grapes and counted how many grapes are in that bunch. And with this bunch, we want to then make inferences about future data. So we have a list of raw data right here. And our raw data is just numbers. It's just given to us as a list, or it's given to us in a table. And our job is to then group this data. So this is raw data. And this, what we're going to do is grouped data. And I'm sure you could then draw some conclusions about why do we want to group data. Well, raw data, can you tell anything really about what's going on? Not really. So what we're going to do is we're going to group it. We are going to make a frequency table, which means that we need to account for every single number that could possibly exist, all the way from 1, which there is a 1 in here, to the maximum number, which is a 21, which means I need to have 21 numbers right here. So I'm going to really quickly make a table that allows for 21 slots, and I'm going to get super detailed with it. Okay, we have 1 through 21 all listed out here, ready to go. Now what I would like for you to do is go through and figure out how many 1s are there, how many 2s are there, and go through and fill out this table. Okay, so we have made a frequency table for this information, and honestly, while it is somewhat grouped into numbers, talking about repetitions that happen here, it doesn't really help us figure out all that much. And so at this point, when we look at our data, we're like, okay, this still seems really widespread. Having 21 intervals that you go through with your frequency diagram is too many intervals. You should have somewhere between 5 and 15 intervals when you're making a frequency table. So you should have somewhere between there. 5 is really not that much, and 15 is really probably too much. So that's really a true accurate range that you should be somewhere in the middle, a nice middle ground. So what we're going to do is make a frequency distribution table. And a frequency distribution table means that we make little ranges that we live between. How we find these ranges is I kind of think, okay, well, I'm going up to 21. What numbers divide into 21? Well, 3 and 7 are the only ones that really divide into 21 nicely, because I don't really want to have my intervals be in terms of percentages or in terms of decimals. So I'm going to say, well, let's divide by 3 and then have our 3. So if we divide by 3 would make 7 intervals, right? So if we take 21, divide by 3, we would then get 7 intervals. Notice there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 interval spots right here, because I already made the table for you, and that's what we're going to go ahead and do. What that means is, since we divided by 3, that means we're going to have intervals of 3. So our first interval is going to be between 1 and 3. Our next one's going to be between 4 and 6, which is 3 numbers, 4, 5, 6, right? And then our next one's between 7 and 9. Next one's between 10 and 12. Next one's between 13 and 15. 16 and 18. And then our last one's 19 and 21. How we write out our range is we make it into a inequality. Notice here that both 1 and 3 are included in this range. That won't always be the case. Later on, we're going to do some frequency tables where we actually don't include the upper number. The upper number then is the beginning of the next range. But since these are all whole numbers, we're going to go ahead and just stick with 1 through 3 and have 1 and 3 both be within that range. Now, notice that I had made a tally here for our frequency. I don't really think we need a tally here because we can just go through and count how many grapes or how many times have we counted grapes between 0 and between 1 and 3, and we've got 1, 2. So those two instances go right here. Verses 4 through 6, we've got 1 plus 2 plus 3, which is 6. And you can go and fill in the rest. All right, so now we have finished our frequency distribution table, and now this data seems a little bit more easy to handle. We can kind of interpret what's going on here. We know where the bulk of our numbers are. We're for the most part between 10 and 12 grapes, although we also skew a little bit towards the 13, 15. So mostly between 10 and 15, right? So we know just a little bit more about what's going on by grouping the data together. So these are two different ways to represent frequency, just a one-to-one correspondence, or this distribution idea of frequency, which has these ranges that we would place it in. And depending on how many intervals you have, you would choose between those two. Now, that is not the only thing that can be included in a frequency table. There are other things that can be included in a frequency table. One of them is called your relative frequency. And if you look in your textbook, it gives you a really fancy definition for relative frequency. It's on, I don't know what page it's on, but if you go to 7.2, there's a really fancy definition for relative frequency. The main idea, what it's really about, is how often something happens. Because remember, our frequency is counting how often something has happened, divided by all outcomes. So a little formula here, although it's not really a formula type of thing, your relative frequency is the frequency number, right? So all of these numbers are your frequency numbers up here. So your frequency divided by your total frequency. In other words, how many times you counted this situation. To find out our total frequency, you add up all of your frequencies. If I were to add all of these guys up, I would get 43. So for this table here, if I wanted to find a relative frequency, all I would have to do is take each of these frequencies and divide them by 43. It gives us a percent that it shows up. So you can think of as a percent. Although sometimes it's represented as a decimal and not as a percent, but that's the idea. All right. We also have cumulative frequency. Cumulative frequency is really just a running total of frequencies. So these are the definitions. If you don't understand what I'm talking about right now, that's totally fine. We're going to put it into practice. So we're going to take this information, this data that we've dealt with above, and now we're going to put it into this frequency table. This frequency table has a lot of different things that you're going to find in a lot of different frequency tables. First of all, it asks for the rate. The rate is this guy, your range that you have here. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy those down real quick. And then I'm going to copy down the frequencies that we have up above here, down at the bottom again. All right. So now we have these frequencies and the ranges. It's asking about the class midpoint. Your rate is your class. Each interval is a class. So we're talking about this range right here. And so the midpoint of that range is the midpoint of this interval. So what we really want to do is find the middle number here. So how do we find the average between two numbers? How do we find the middle of two numbers? Is we add the two numbers up and then divide by 2. So that's going to be 4 divided by 2, which is 2, which, I mean, you can figure out already because it's the number that's smack dab in the middle. So we've got the middle between 4 and 6. If you add 4 and 6 up and divide it by 2, it gives you 5, or you can just realize, like, oh, that's just this middle number right here. A pretty straightforward idea, although I'm pretty sure that when I ask you about it when we come into class, you're gonna be like, wait, what was that again? So just try and keep it just ready to go. Just remember that that's what it is. It's really easy. It's just the middle of each interval. All right, relative frequency. Now remember that relative frequency is when we're talking about a specific frequency divided by the total times it occurs. So the relative frequency of this guy right here is going to be 2 divided by the total, which is 43. I'm going to write that as a decimal, which is 0.0465. That, if you multiply by 100, is 4.65%, or 0.465. For our next one, our frequency is 6. Taking 6 and dividing by 43, we get 0.1395. So 13.95%, or 0.1395. I want you to go ahead and continue filling this all out. Okay, so finishing filling out all of your relative frequencies, if you think about it as a percent, if I said 28% of all grape bunches had grapes between 10 and 12 grapes. So this is where we take this idea of, okay, this occurs this much out of your total percent. Okay? So now talking about cumulative frequency, we're talking about a running tally or a running total. All that means is that we're adding the previous frequency all the way up to the cumulative frequency. So for instance, with the first guy, we have 2, right? We had 0 frequency, we added 2, now we're at 2 frequency. So now we've counted something twice, and then we go through between this interval, and now we've added 6 things to the things that we've counted. So now it's 2 plus 6, and now we have a cumulative frequency of 8. This means that 8 of the bunches were 6 or less. For the next guy, we go to the next frequency, we add 7 more to this total that we're talking about. So we do 7 plus 8 and 15. That means 15 bunches had 9 grapes or less. So from there, you could do 15 divided by 43 and talk about that's close to 33%. So you could talk about like a third of all of the bunches had 9 or less grapes. So you're using this cumulative frequency to then start ranging the groups of data that you have. You've already grouped it, and then you use this cumulative frequency to even group it more. We talk about percentiles in this way as well. If you've heard about being like, oh, you're in the 94th percentile, that means that you are up to or like higher in the like at 94% of your peers. You're there with the rest of them. Yeah. Okay, so if you take 15 and 12, you get 27. Let's go ahead and continue filling this out.